Before I forget, there's one more specification for this project, and in order to 3D print something, and that is to make sure that the actual scale of your model is to a kind of real life scale. So I've kind of modeled this. I have no idea what this like to life scale would be. So let me go ahead and go into my settings, preferences, and under settings here, I'm able to see what my working units are. So right now they're set to centimeters, and I'm going to actually go ahead and change that to inches and say save. And now you can see that the size of my xylophone has shrunk compared to the size of my grid, and that's because the I've increased uh, the grid so that each unit here is not a centimeter long, but each unit is an inch. And so I want to just make sure, let me go ahead now and look at my attribute editor for the body. And I think because I froze transformations at some point, I just have my scale here as 1. So that's okay, but I actually want to just make sure when I'm exporting this that it's to a kind of scale, to the right scale here set. So I think it might be. Also, let me go back to my settings preferences and under settings, and it doesn't have an ability to see how many, what the grid is made up of, how many units are in a grid. So I'm just going to go ahead and count it. I think it's 10 maybe. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's 12. Okay, so in one of these boxes, that makes sense. So one of these kind of larger squares of the grid is a foot. So I actually think, looking at my whole model here, and I'm going to go and actually place, oh, I don't want a snapped grid here. I want to go ahead and place the back of my model to the back of the grid, and I actually think that this is to scale. It just so happens that it is. I think my xylophone is about a foot long. It might actually be a little bit smaller. If I'm thinking then about the height of this. And I can actually go and double check what these heights are by just adding a separate polygon object here. And maybe I'll like embed it in. Go to my front view and scale this up. And now I can see how tall it is, how tall my whole model is. Set this kind of where the wheels are. So in my Y direction, it's about 3 inches tall. I'm going to quickly go get a tape measure and measure my xylophone. So the dimensions on it are not correct. 2.5 by 11. So what I can do is change this to 2.5 and use this as a reference for scaling my whole model. So when I'm going to scale my entire model, I'm going to want to put it in a group first. And the reason why is I'll show you. If I go ahead and scale this, it's going to maintain its position while it scales. And I don't want it to do that. So I'm going to create a group. I'm going to go to Edit, and after highlighting everything in my model, make sure I don't have my cube highlighted, and I don't. I'm going to go ahead and group these together. And I am going to just center the pivot just because I want to eventually move this back to the origin of my grid. So I'm going to go back now to my side view here, and I'm going to scale this down. And I measured from the bottom of the wheels to kind of the top of the xylophone. So that's about right. And then let me just go ahead and check in perspective mode. If I go and I'm kind of creating a bounding box around my object here, so I can take its measurements. So let me go ahead and drag this to the end, and I'm going to move this front face to the front. And what's the size of this now? Go back to object mode. Oh, it's not going to tell me because I translated those faces rather than scaling it. Okay, so let me go back here, and instead I'm going to work in object mode and just move everything. So let me go ahead and just kind of scale this, scale it and move it in place. Okay, great. So in this direction, it's 11 inches. So this is close enough to the actual size of my xylophone. I'm going to delete that bounding box there. And now that I have this centered, let me go ahead and position my whole model here in the center of the grid. So it's right at the origin. And now I also want to raise it up so that the wheels are sitting flat on the bottom of the grid. And that way my model would be ready to export into something like Unity, and it would sit flat on the surface of the terrain in Unity. Okay, so or if I was for some reason to 3D print this all as one object, whatever is sitting flat on that bed, this grid is actually the 0 point in the y direction, and so it replicates the base, the plane, the base at which you 3D print on top of. So let me go ahead and change this pivot point of my group pivot to the bottom of the wheel here. And I'm going to go to snap to point and work in my side view and press D and move this right down here to the very bottom. Now I wouldn't be able to 3D print from this one point, you know, but I do want my model to sit flat on the ground plane. And that is the deepest point. So now let me go back to my perspective view here, and I'm going to, instead of snap to point, now snap to grid, and move my whole model up so it's sitting flat on the ground plane. Okay, so let me go ahead and save this. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ungroup. So I'm saving my Maya file like this, but the way I've asked you to submit your project is to actually export the model as an OBJ. And so I'm not sure if I do that with all of these meshes, if it's going to, I think it will export everything as a single OBJ, but let me go ahead and see if I can, if I need to combine them first before I can export it. But I do want to save my Maya scene in this state and then export my model separately And if I do want to maintain that these meshes are all different. So let me go ahead and go down to export selection. And file type here, I want to choose OBJ export. And I don't know if I want to turn groups on or off. I guess we'll keep them all on. Let's just see what the default, how the default works. Let me say export selection. Now this window will pop up, and I'm going to want to save this as my name. So then when, let me open a new scene, and I can go ahead and import my OBJ. And so I actually have two files here. I have the OBJ and then I have a material file. Okay, and there it is. So it said something about the fact that I grouped everything together, but and so it has all that information here. Ooh, I wonder what all this information is. I wonder if this is because of the groups that I had everything in. At any rate, I have my one model now as an OBJ. This is how I want you to submit your final project. If I was going to be 3D printing this, I actually would be selecting each component that I would be 3D printing. So before I had grouped everything together, I would actually select my individual meshes and then export those as OBJs. And so then I would be 3D printing this in parts and not as one whole. But so you can just upload, if you do have multiple meshes in your project, so you're able to just upload one file rather than zipping a whole file. Just upload your OBJ. And that should do it for this week. Next week, we will be talking about texturing and be looking at a expansion program to Maya called Mudbox. And so happy modeling.